Good Monday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for April the 3rd. Today, we're kicking off the week, or I guess we kicked off the week yesterday, kicking off the work week with a read through Leviticus chapter 23, which contains the instructions and the teaching concerning the holy days of Israel. So we'll read about that here in this text and make a few notes and observations from this text. Thanks so much for taking some time to read along with me today on this Monday morning. Let me get the text of Leviticus 23 up on the screen for us so we can read along together. Leviticus 23 in verse number 1, Yahweh spoke to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and tell them, these are my appointed times, the times of Yahweh, that you will proclaim as sacred assemblies," special days. "Work may be done for 6 days, but on the seventh day there is to be a Sabbath of complete rest, a sacred assembly. You are not to do any work. It is a Sabbath to Yahweh wherever you live. These are Yahweh's appointed times, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times. The Passover to Yahweh comes in the first month at twilight, on the 14th day of the month. The festival of unleavened bread to Yahweh is on the 15th day of the same month. For 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you are to hold a sacred assembly. You are not to do any daily work. You are to present a food offering to Yahweh for 7 days. On the seventh day there will be a sacred assembly. Do not do any daily work." Yahweh spoke to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when you enter the land I'm giving you and reap its harvest, you are to bring the first sheaf of your harvest to the priest. He will present the sheaf before Yahweh so that you may be accepted. The priest is to present it on the day after the Sabbath. On the day you present the sheaf, you are to offer a year-old male lamb without blemish as a burnt offering to Yahweh. Its grain offering is to be 4 quarts of fine flour mixed with oil as a food offering to Yahweh, a pleasing aroma, and its drink offering will be 1 quart of wine. You must not eat bread, roasted grain, or any new grain until this very day, and until you have brought the offering to your God. This is to be a permanent statute throughout your generations, wherever you live. You are to count 7 complete weeks, starting from the day after the Sabbath, the day you brought the sheaf of the presentation offering. You are to count 50 days until the day after the 7th Sabbath, and then present an offering of new grain to Yahweh. Bring 2 loaves of bread from your settlements as a presentation offering, each of them made from 4 quarts of fine flour, baked with yeast, as first fruits to Yahweh. You are to present with the bread 7 unblemished male lambs a year old, 1 young bull, and 2 rams. They will be a burnt offering to Yahweh, with their grain offerings and drink offerings, a food offering, a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. You are also to prepare 1 male goat as a sin offering and 2 male lambs a year old as a fellowship sacrifice. The priest will present the lambs with the bread of first fruits as a presentation offering before Yahweh. The bread and the 2 lambs will be holy to Yahweh for the priest. On that same day, you are to make a proclamation and hold a sacred assembly. You are not to do any daily work. This is to be a permanent statute wherever you live throughout your generations. When you reap the harvest of your land, you are not to reap all the way to the edge of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and resident alien. I am Yahweh, your God. Verse 23, Yahweh spoke to Moses, "Tell the Israelites, in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you are to have a day of complete rest, commemoration, and trumpet blast, a sacred assembly. You must not do any daily work, but you must present a food offering to Yahweh." Yahweh again spoke to Moses, "The 10th day of this 7th month is the day of atonement. You are to hold a sacred assembly and practice self-denial. You are to present a food offering to Yahweh. On this particular day, you are not to do any work, for it is a day of atonement to make atonement for yourselves before Yahweh your God. If any person does not practice self-denial on this particular day, he is to be cut off from his people. I will destroy among his people anyone who does any work on this same day. You are not to do any work. This is a permanent statute throughout your generations wherever you live. It will be a Sabbath of complete rest for you, and you must practice self-denial. You are to observe your Sabbath from the evening of the 9th day of the month until the following evening. Yahweh spoke to Moses, tell the Israelites the festival of shelters to Yahweh begins on the 15th day of the 7th month and continues for 7 days. There is to be a sacred assembly on the first day. You are not to do any daily work. You are to present a food offering to Yahweh for 7 days. On the 8th day, you are to hold a sacred assembly and present a food offering to Yahweh. It is a solemn assembly. You are not to do any daily work. These are Yahweh's appointed times that you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies for presenting food offerings to Yahweh, burnt offerings and grain offerings, sacrifices and drink offerings, each on its own designated day. These are in addition to the offerings for Yahweh's Sabbaths, your gifts and all your vows, and your freewill offerings that you give to Yahweh. You are to celebrate Yahweh's festival on the 15th day of the 7th month for 7 days after you have gathered the produce of the land. There will be complete rest on the first day and complete rest on the 8th day. On the first day, you are to take the product of majestic trees, palm fronds, boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and rejoice before Yahweh your God for 7 days. You are to celebrate it as a festival to Yahweh 7 days each year. This is a permanent statute for you throughout your generations. Celebrate it in the 7th month. You are to live in shelters for 7 days. All the native born of Israel must live in shelters, so that your generations may know that I made the Israelites live in shelters when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your God. So Moses declared Yahweh's appointed times to the Israelites. And that is Leviticus chapter 23. All right, so the holy days that are discussed here, number 1 in verses 1 through 3 is the Sabbath day. This was a weekly observance, and this was something that was to be done wherever they were. Wherever they were to take time to rest, to observe this day of rest. But also involved here is an assembly, which happened weekly. So it was a time for people to gather together to worship God together and to commemorate this day together on this 7th day of the week, what we know as Saturday. Moving on from there, we see the Passover, which took place on Nisan the 14th, which is around March, April of our calendar. Remember, whenever they came out of Egypt, their calendar reset. They had a new beginning of the year, and that was the Nisan 14. This is the first month of their new year, and that happened on Nisan 14. Well, then Nisan 15th through 21st is the the festival of unleavened bread. So in the Passover, what should have been on their mind would have been freedom given to them by Yahweh through his redeeming them from the people of Egypt. So freedom and redemption would have been mainstays in their minds during the Passover. And then with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, there is a holiness aspect to this, clearing out the yeast and the leaven from the house, and removing corruption. So there's these big ideas that are associated with each of these festivals. They were not just random things that were put together. They were not just done so that they would have things to remember throughout the year, but they were just random things to think about throughout the year. But they were very purposeful. Freedom, redemption, holiness, sanctification, all of these thoughts would have been going through their minds as they were doing these particular festivals, especially whenever it comes to the Passover and the Feast of Festival of Unleavened Bread. In 9 through 14, we have the Feast of First Fruits. This would cause their mind to focus on God's provision, and then also showing God reverence by giving him the first fruits, that the first fruits belong to Yahweh. So as they're going through their harvest, the first thing that would have been done is giving those first fruits, that first sheaf to Yahweh. They belong to him. In verses 15, beginning of verse 15, going through verse, let's see here, 22, we have the Festival of Weeks, what is going to be known later on as Pentecost. This day took place 50 days after the Passover. This took place on their month, Sivan the 6th. The wheat harvest would have been something that was celebrated at this time. Again, God providing. but also this would have taken their minds back to Mount Sinai and the happenings that took place whenever they were there during their journey. There was an assembly that was held, as well as many different burnt offerings and different sacrifices of many sorts. And then also just note in verses, let's see, verse 21 and 22, these instructions concerning not harvesting everything, but leaving some on the outside for the poor. We've seen that back in chapter 19 and verses 9 and 10. Verses 23 through 25, so verses 23, 24, and 25 are the Feast of the Trumpets. This would have taken place on their month of Tishri the first. This was a day focused on assembling and renewal. You'll notice that on these days, again, there was not just the component of pausing and thinking, but also gathering together and participating in these assemblies together with their fellow Israelite. In verses 26 through 32, we have the Day of Atonement mentioned again. We talked about that back in Leviticus chapter 16. There was an assembly, there was self-denial, there was work, there was the atoning of sacred space and the people. Remember, got to make sure that everything is on the up and up. And just in case any sort of malfeasance has happened during the year on this day, there was a total reset. All of God's sacred space is cleansed. All the people are cleansed. There is a great reset. People get to start over anew in service to God. And then finally, in verses 33 through 43, we have the Festival of Shelters, or Tabernacles, or Booths. It's known by various names. This would have been a festival for them to remember their wandering in the wilderness and commemorating their ancestors having lived in these temporary shelters while they were on their journey from Egypt to Exodus. Again, there's an assembly. Again, there is no work. This is a week-long festival. So on the 8th day, there was a great feast to commemorate the day. And while they're doing this, they are to live in these particular in these shelters. They were to gather. Let me see here. They were to gather in verse number 40 on the first day of this. So on Tishri 15th, and this goes through Tishri 21st, you are to take the product of majestic trees, again, the palm fronds, the boughs of the leafy trees, and the willows of the brook, and rejoice. Then you are to, it seems, from the way I would read it, they would take these components and use them to create these shelters in which they would live in for this week. Again, they are associating with themselves with their ancestors. Now, this one particular is pretty cool. At least I have some experience with it whenever I lived in Little Rock for that year, working with the church there as an intern. Again, I think I mentioned it before that the area in which the church house in Little Rock sits, the area honestly that was hit by the tornado recently, right around the area, but there's a very high population of Orthodox Jews. So I can remember very vividly the house right across the road from the church house, the very first house on that road. They put up during that year. They actually made a shelter, and they observed this particular festival as a part of their calendar. So again, we're talking about beginning in Nisan and going through Tishri. So for us, it would be March through October, and then it doesn't seem as if too much happens later on. Actually, I'll take that back. Let's see here. In John chapter 10, there's a mentioning of the festival of dedication, a festival of lights. Some refer to that as Hanukkah. That takes place later on in the year. And then in Esther's book that we'll read later on in the year, there's a festival of Purim that takes place. That would have been in February and March. So for the most part, their festivals took place between our calendar of March and October, with some other ones sprinkled in there a couple of times. But again, why have all these festivals? What is the point of them? I really appreciate one of these resources sharing these things. They said the Holy Calendar reminded the people that time belonged to God. Good point. A calendar of agricultural festivals reminded them that all of nature belonged to God. A seasonal calendar taught the people that God established times for recreation, time for them to do things, and then time for them to focus on Him. 3 Through the requirements of the Holy Calendar, God established and maintained his people as a community of believers. They're not just living disconnected lives, but they would come together in these assemblies to worship God. Observing the calendar of festivals preserved Israel's heritage. Many of these had historical components to them, had historical roots. The gatherings of the whole nation brought greater praise and glory to God. Again, not just individuals worshiping, but these individuals coming together in a community to worship. And then finally, the festivals in the year charted the essential aspects of God's redemptive work. Again, many of the things that he did for them in establishing them as a nation and preserving them as a nation. So this is the calendar of the holy days for Israel. Hopefully this gives you a little better insight to what their year looked like and the many things that they would have been observing from time to time. Tomorrow in chapter 24, we have just a little short read here. We'll read about the tabernacle, oil, and bread, and then a case of blasphemy. Get a little case law here, learning a little bit about dealing out justice in this particular case. We will read about that here in Leviticus 24. If you have any questions about this text or any questions about anything recently that we've read, please feel free to leave that in the comments section. And I do hope, again, that this is helping to familiarize ourselves with the entirety of Scripture, even something that's foreign to us, even something that we are not familiar with simply by way of it not being really applicable to us, a lot of these things. Hopefully this has helped to strengthen our knowledge of Scripture as we go along through the text. Again, if you have any questions, let those be known below. And I'll see y'all tomorrow as we read together from Leviticus chapter 24. Take care and God bless.